Okay, everybody, it is Thursday, April 18th, in the year beyond Thunderdome 2013, and of course, sad news this week with the Boston Marathon bombing. And to all the people and victims, our hearts and prayers go out to you. Mine certainly does. I want to talk about that today, so I'm going to get right into it. Because as you can see from this thick sheaf of papers, there's a lot to talk about. Needless to say, I am one of those who, when I heard of this bombing, immediately had suspicions that this was something that was deliberate. There's an increasing amount of evidence that looks to be the case. We're told that these pressure cooker bombs are to blame. And I'm not going to go into all the reasons I suspect, at least concerning the bombing itself, why I think that. I'm going to be looking at a context. And I have to tell you, at the start of this News and Views, that so many of you emailed me a lot of information. Mr. PT, a lady named Gail, a lot of other people, and I did some research on my own. And I'm going to be presenting a thesis, a hypothesis of analysis of what I think this may be connected to. For those of you who've read my most recent book, Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations, you'll immediately recognize the context. To those of you who haven't, if you do get that book, read the first part of the book, and I think you'll see what all of this may be connected to. But I'm going to do my best to connect some dots. I want to begin by reading part of an email from Mr. PT that occurred on the day of the bombing. And let's remember what the day of the bombing was. It was also in the United States of America, for those of you who don't know it, the day that everyone has to have their income tax filed by. That's April 15th every year, unless that falls on the weekend, and then of course it's the following Monday. But this year that fell on Monday. So what I want to do is read what he says. Number one, the takedown was orchestrated. Now what he's talking about is that on the same day of the Boston Marathon, you'll recall that there was a massive global sell-off of gold and silver that drove the price per ounce of gold and silver down a great deal. Now most of this, let's be honest, most of this was paper bullion, in other words certificates of bullion rather than the physical commodity. We'll get back to that. But he says this takedown was orchestrated. Many commodities have fallen in the paper contract markets. Are you aware that there has been a few days ago a massive landslide at one of North America's premier silver and copper mines, wiped out about 15% of North American annual production? We'll get into that in a moment too. The VIX, that is volatility indicator, is so off the charts that you can almost say that it has gone into reverse or upside down. Commodities are volatile by nature, but not this volatile. 3. Just as the markets were set to close, just as they were closing, and all the news would be focused on this event, in other words, the commodities event, kaboom, in Boston. In other words, the bombs went off in Boston. Number 4, public spectacle on Patriots Day with JFK involved too. Now, this is a reference to the initial reporting of the Boston Marathon bombing, that there was either a fire or a bomb at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library in Massachusetts, which is another interesting coincidence. So I want you to bear that in mind. And then I got this comment from a lady named Gail on my website. Why is this happening? She says, well, because first of all, the Bretton Woods Agreement and the Federal Reserve Bank Charter are set to expire very soon. And she points out that many countries are beginning to trade directly with each other in their own currencies. Now, this, you'll recall, I had pointed out that China and Australia recently made an agreement, and just most recently, last week I believe it was, France and China agreed to do the same thing. In other words, what you're watching, folks, is the unraveling of the US dollar as a reserve currency, and with that you're watching the unraveling of the power, the financial power of the Anglo-American financial oligarchs. Now, she says this. She points out something very interesting that I have pointed out in Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations. The central banks and prime banks that are under the influence of these financial oligarchs have been selling or rehypothecating hello. Selling or rehypothecating. I'm sorry about that, folks. My computer just froze for a moment. She says that the central banks and prime banks have been selling or rehypothecating gold several times over, basically selling one bar of gold to several different people. In other words, it'd be like selling a car to several different owners and taking the money and running. Now, the problem with that is, of course, that if you call for physical possession of gold, then you have to come up with it, and that they have not been able to do. But she goes on to say the bankers had two aces up their sleeve. This was going to solve their problem. Number one, Barrick Resources, remember that name, and the Pascua Lama mine, and number two, the Kennecott copper mine in Utah. Then she points out both of these aces up their sleeve have blown up at the same time. Barrick does not have legal title deeds to the property and is now involved in litigation. The probable reserves were nearly 18 million ounces of gold and 700 million ounces of silver. Germany, she says, ordered a lot of gold. They did not deliver. Barrick has been selling this non-existent gold in the form of GL gold certificates, no physical behind it, and that's why Germany demanded their gold back. Well, I don't know, quite frankly, if that part of the story is true, but we're going to find out some very interesting information about Barrick in a moment, because she's put her finger, and my point in reading that was to point the finger in the direction of these large mines, and Barrick is one of these companies that I want to draw your attention to. And bear that in mind, because we're going to return to Barrick, because I don't think, contrary to her or the initial reading, I don't think that these mines are the central story. They are a clue pointing to what I think the central story is. Alright? So, then the next article I want to draw your attention to is this one. It was pointed out by that lady that I just read her comment. Force majeure was the end game all along. COMEX will default in the next week. And then another story from the UK Daily Telegraph. German wise men push for wealth seizure to fund European Monetary Union bailouts. This is a story that appeared in the British Daily Telegraph by Ambrose Evans Pritchard. And again, it's tied, I think, to Germany's request to get its gold reserves back from the Federal Reserve. And it looks like my computer may have frozen once again, but I'm going to keep going here in the hopes that it will unfreeze. There we are. And then another article that was sent to me by Mr. PT, the first email that I read you. Massive $20 billion worth of paper gold sell orders were placed to stop loss. In other words, a stop loss order, in case you don't know what this is if a market is going down, you can pre-order a sell. In other words, if the market looks like it's going to go down precipitously, in order to stop your losses, you have a standing order to sell at a certain price when it reaches that price to minimize your losses. So that was what was going on. And there were $20 billion. Now, let's be honest here, folks. That sounds like a lot of money, but let's remember that in the context of the credit default swaps, the derivatives that led to the meltdown of the bubble a few years ago, those derivatives are in the quadrillions of dollars. In other words, they exceed the total amount of the gross domestic product of the entire world. Alright? Now, the final thing I want to draw your attention to, and this, and again, I'm rushing here, folks, because there's so much context to paint as to what I think may be going on here. Ultimately, it really doesn't have anything to do with the mines, with Barrick and so on. But this story is about, and let me see if I can hold it up for you. It's called protestbarrick.net. The President, the Gold Mine, and the Politics of Greed. This is by Jeffrey Sinclair. And this article was posted July 11th, 2009. And what this article points out is that former President George Bush Sr. is a consultant or has some sort of status at that time in the 1990s with Barrick. All right. Now, that's all the context that I want to paint, and I want to refer now to what I said in Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations. For those of you who haven't read that book, I spent a lot of time in the book outlining what I call the bearer bonds scandals. These scandals that began with the seizure by Italian financial police of two Japanese men that were carrying $134 billion worth of bearer bonds. And these are bonds that are not issued to any name. They're simply a piece of paper that whoever has physical possession of that paper can then sell. All right, so it's almost as good as money in that rarefied atmosphere of high financial transaction. Now, I see my computer may have frozen again, so I'm going to keep talking in hopes that it will come back. Here we go. Come on, computer. Come on, computer. I do apologize, everybody, if this is still coming through. I have been having endless computer problems, and it looks like we might be back. Alright, here we are. Now, the bearer bond scandals, as I pointed out in Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations, in my opinion, is intimately related to the immediate post-war period in the United States when the deals were struck between the oligarchs, the technocrats, and the military-industrial complex, and in particular within American intelligence. You have to understand, those of you who are not aware of it, American intelligence has deep ties to Wall Street through firms like Harriman and so on, and Cromwell and Sullivan, and all of these big Wall Street law firms. So, in a certain sense, the Central Intelligence Agency represents that interest. All right. Now, after World War II, I believe, and I've outlined the case in numerous books that I've published, the United States made what I call the dirty deal with the Axis devil. On the one hand, I've always maintained that the early Bilderberg meetings were for the purpose of coordination between the surviving members of the European elite, many of whom had ties with the Nazi Party, and the financial oligarchs in London and New York, to coordinate how they were going to use and launder all that Nazi plunder. That was kept more or less off the books. All right. The other dirty part of the deal is in the Far East, American intelligence learned of the Operation Golden Lily, which was the Japanese plunder of the bullion wealth of Asia and China in particular. Now, as I detailed in Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations, President Truman took the decision to keep all of this information top secret. In other words, what all of this vast wealth was going to be used to do was to create a huge political covert actions and, I believe, black projects research slush fund for the post-World War II period. It means that we have an entirely hidden and basically fraudulent system of finance at a very rarefied level. And this is what I think is really represented by the commodities sell-off. This system is coming unraveled. There are players in the world that know all about this system, and they're basically trying to expose it and bring it down. This is why I think Germany is so interesting to watch here, because I've argued that there does exist to this day in Europe a covert underground that is very fascist in outlook, and I've located that underground to a certain extent in NATO's covert operations intelligence units, because those units were basically the brainchild of the Nazis at the end of World War II, these stay-behind units. That became part of NATO's strategy in case of an invasion by the Warsaw Pact. But after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, these units were retained, and I believe, and many European politicians, I've blogged about this on the website, believe that these units are behind the terrorism incidents that occurred and still do occur in Europe. And some people now are seeing the Boston Marathon bombing as these Operation Gladio type of NATO terrorist false flag events coming home to America. I don't know if that's true or not. I have my suspicions that it is. But my real point here is that if you look now at Barrack, at Bush, and so on and so forth, this points to the Leo Wanta affair, all right, and the allegations that there was to be a trust set up to bring a lot of this money out into the public. And of course, internet allegations have flown around that President Bush basically prevented that. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if that's false. But what I really suspect all of this is tied to is this hidden system of finance, and that's what they're trying to keep quiet. If that gets exposed, if that vast system of fraud in the Western financial system gets exposed, then we're looking at a very interesting thing. And this brings me to my final point, one that I want you to ponder very carefully. What President Truman's decision meant was, in a certain sense, that the central banks, even though they were driving, particularly the Federal Reserve, driving and controlling the post-war recovery of the West, to a certain extent they had lost influence to the intelligence agencies and to the needs of the military-industrial complex. So it's a very, very uneasy alliance. Certainly I think the central banks are complicit, but what I've been trying to get people to perhaps understand is that they may not be the central players anymore driving all of this. This may now be so inextricably intertwined with the intelligence agencies, the needs or perceived needs of the American military-industrial complex, that it is now the banks that are subservient to those interests rather than vice versa. That's a rather radical case to argue. I suspect, however, that that is the reason that you see not only a financial and geopolitical realignment taking place with all of these nations making deals, unilateral, bilateral agreements to trade directly in their own currencies, bypassing the dollar as a reserve, but also the formation of geopolitical blocs to challenge the power of the Western financial oligarchy. So this is a very, very interesting, significant set of events. And that said, then, I tend to agree with those people who are seeing the Boston Marathon bombing as much less than coincidental. I think the real news that day, in spite of the human suffering, was this financial takedown. The Boston Marathon bombing, I think, is connected with it, but how, I'm not yet certain. So anyway, my heart and prayers to those of you who suffered in that tragic incident. But let's also watch the emerging story, who they are going to fix the blame upon. Already we've seen letters, poison letters, mailed to a very conservative Republican senator and to the president. So, you know, this could be played as blaming it on the domestic radical right or the domestic radical left, who knows. But it's going to be a very interesting story to see what they cook up. Anyway, folks, that's it for this week's News and Views. God bless everybody, and I'll see you on the flip side.